Hello, everyone. This is Jimmy Cultist back again with another logic video. We were held up for a little while because there was a medical emergency concerning our editor, Monty. In case you were wondering why we didn't put out a video on our normal schedule, that's the reason why. But now that we are back in business, let's go ahead and talk about how to create power-ups, or I guess power-up states, maybe you could call it. Basically, like in Mario, when you grab the fire flower, then you are able to throw fireballs, that sort of thing. Temporary power-up. I guess the invulnerability video that we had sort of might be similar, but this is a bit different. I go into a bit more detail with this. Now the first thing we're going to need is some kind of object or thing to apply our power-up. I've made this fire, which I have grouped with a solid piece of material. I simply stamped out a block, set it to stamp shape and grid snap, stamped it out, used L1 and square to open its tweak menu, made it invisible and non-collidable, and then I grouped it with the fire, which also is its own separate group so that I can move it out of the way if I need to reposition things. Then I put a microchip on the block, and if you're having trouble reaching your microchips, the X-ray helps with that. Then just press L1 and X to open up your microchip. And for the power-up itself, it's actually pretty simple. There's only one piece of logic you need. That's a trigger zone called, well, set to detect tag. It's not called anything. But the tag it's set to detect is fire power up. I've made it into a little square cube because we're doing a two-dimensional game right now. But you could make it a cylinder or almost anything you wanted in here. Also, I don't really have any labels set for it because it only detects a tag. And I opened up the puppet's logic by scoping in with L1 and X and then just opening up this little thing here. And I put a microchip out called power-ups. Inside power-ups, I put fire. Presumably you'd have more power-ups if you're making a full game, like, I don't know, wind, water, something. Grease. You'd have other power-ups. But I put out this one microchip as a demonstration. Now the first thing I went about making was the actual action of spitting fire, which is what he does when he's in his powered-up state. And this may be a familiar configuration for you. You've probably seen it a lot if you've been watching our videos. But it's a node, and I've hooked up a NOT gate to the power of the node, which if you want to access that, just press L1 and square to open this up, and connect that with X to the power. And I've connected the node to a timeline set to play once. The timeline's pretty speedy. I put it on 200%. And I put a switch leading into the NOT gate to prevent playback. So this thing won't be able to play again until the duration is over. That way he can't spam fireballs too much. It's still pretty fast, but not, not too much. And you may have noticed that the NOT gate itself is actually dark, which means the power is off. And I intentionally have done that because it's actually a part of the process of creating the power-up. But I'll explain that in a little bit, why I turned the power off. Now in here, I have an action recorder set to keyframe mode. And I've got a simple spitting animation for when he shoots the fireballs. I've covered action recorders in a separate video. But here's the emitter, which emits this projectile, which is our fireball. fireball is relatively simple. It's a group set to movable. Now the square on which the chip is mounted is actually non-collidable and invisible. It's actually this solid sculpt, which I've made very loose so that it resembles fire, and I've added an evaporate effect to it. But it is the actual collidable element, and it's also set to be physically very bouncy and have a lot of density, so that it behaves like a fireball somewhat, and it will bounce around. It also is triggered by colliding with scenery, at least the trigger zone that detects scenery. I've set it to label. And it just emits a simple flame effect when it collides with things. It only does this once, and the flame effect only lasts for a duration of 1 second. So max emitted 1, max emitted at once 1. So it's just going to do it once, because I didn't want too many of these little things flying out everywhere. And it is hooked up to a sound called immolation, so that it sounds like it's actually singeing the ground when it hits it. I've also added a little timeline set to play once with a mover on it set to 100% movement strength and 50% overall dampening, local space, a speed of 8.0, and it's facing that way. So the fireball will fly that way upon being emitted. And basically this will give it velocity, but it'll gradually start to fall after a while since it's set to movable. If you didn't have it set to movable, it would presumably just travel on forever and into infinity, like you were working with non-Newtonian physics or whatever. But the projectile is not too important. I just wanted to cover it very quickly. That's what he's spitting. I've also got a sound effect called backdraft to add a little bit of pizzazz to when he's shooting the fireballs. But that's the basic spitting action, which I do by opening up the controller sensor with L1 and square and taking the square button output and sticking it into the input of this node. So when he presses square, he can do it. But since this is currently turned off, he cannot press square to fire the fireball. That's what the power-up system over here is all about. We'll call this logic since it's a bit more accurate to call it that. But basically, if you recall, we put a little trigger zone on this fire called Fire Power Up, and now we have a tag, which once it comes in contact with this, it will be active, and its output will trigger this selector to go to input B. It also resets this timer, but I'll explain how that works in a bit. So basically, input B is connected to a chip, a microchip, on which I've put some logic. I've got a little fire sound effect, so that it seems like you're burning when the power-up is active. And I have this little action recorder set to keyframe mode. It has a single or a couple of animations on it, but it pretty much just loops. There's no other variation to it. And it turns on the NOT gate. It also turns on, it's kind of less important, but it turns on a little microchip with a timeline inside it set to loop. And this timeline has like a little hot animation where he looks like he's on fire. And this keyframe for when you're in your idle state, at least it's hooked up to the output of your idle state, activates the timeline. But since the chip is off, this won't really be normally working that way. It only works that way when this is activating the chip. So that kind of changes your idle stance when you're in this state. I've also got this little microchip which contains the visuals, which are basically just me making his trash can red to make it appear that it's hot. I upped the tint amount, as you can see, to make it red. I'm also making his eyes bulge out. And I've got this action recorder, which makes the flames that are normally invisible visible. And I made them all a group. One inside of his head, another one inside of his torso area, so that you can easily activate the invisibility without having to make each individual flame, you know, visible. Set to loop, of course. Also, make sure that this keyframe is turned on. If it's like this, make sure it's turned on like that. I've had a little slow power up and a little slow power down. I don't really know if it makes a huge difference, but it might make it more natural when it's activated. But that's pretty much your state of being. That's your logic for when he's in his powered up state. Now next in the B output, I've got it leading to this little timer set to a target time of 8 seconds. And basically what happens is, when B is active, this timer will begin to tick, and when it's finished, the pulse output will reset to A and essentially turn off our power-up and put us back into our normal state, you know, so that the process can begin again. I've also got this tag hooked up to the reset value so that when you jump in the fire, it'll reset the duration, allowing you to go longer. I've also got the output, which basically tells you the, I guess you'd call it the percentile of the percentage of how much of the timer has elapsed, is governed by the output. And the output I've hooked up to a calculator set to greater than 0.86, so about 80% I should say, or 86% of the way on this timer. This timeline will be triggered, which is set to play once. And what it does is, all I do is have this action recorder inside set to loop, and it shuts off the visuals, and this is like a little early indicator that your power-up is about to be lost, similar to the Mario games where your power-up starts to flicker when you're about to lose it. But that's pretty much the entire process. I guess there is a little bit of something I forgot to mention, that when you're spitting fireballs, I turn off the procedural poses, or whatever. The poses chip I turn off. You could probably turn off the jump chip too, I don't know. Depends on what you want. That's not so important though. It doesn't ruin the logic, it just makes things more visually pleasing. So let's go ahead and get powered up. As we can see, it's working as intended. And it flickers a bit and then goes away. Now let's test out our fireballs. And once it's gone, we can't fire them anymore. So, that's a power-up state for you. If you were curious how that worked, that's how to implement this function into Dreams. There's probably some other ways to do it. I think, though, this is a very cost-effective and fairly straightforward methodology that you could follow, so I hope you find that helpful in whatever endeavors you may be active in. Thanks for watching! Hopefully this was an insightful video or otherwise enjoyable. If it was, then go ahead and subscribe if you can, and hit the bell to keep up with our videos. Also, subscribed or not, give a like. If you have any questions or statements, leave a comment. We try to answer all comments. If you like what we do here and want to help out, consider becoming a channel member. Alternatively, you can check out the link in the description to support us through Patreon. Until next time, take it easy. That's all for now.